Okay, so it's 1 minute past 1, so I think we'll make a start. My name is Charmaine Cadino, and first of all, can I welcome everyone to attending this webinar that we, Delta EE, are doing in conjunction with Kaluza and UK Power Networks. I will be your host and MC for today. We've got a really exciting hour or so that we've got planned. So we're going to have a webinar for about half an hour, 40 minutes, which will have some time for Q&A at the end from our host of resident experts. So today we're very excited to bring you to launch our new white paper, which is entitled Smart Electric Vehicle Charging with the Customer and Grid in Mind. And today you can speak from myself and my colleague Abhishek from Delta EE, Valtz from Kaluza, and Evie for UK Power Networks. So for those of you who are not familiar with Delta EE, we are a market research consultancy specializing in the energy transition, so helping our clients and the wider market move to the transition faster. We have a very deep speciality in electric vehicle research, and I'll pass over to my colleagues to introduce themselves as well. Abhishek?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Abhishek. I'm part of the electric vehicle and electricity team at Delta EE. And we've been focusing on the key themes and hot topics within the EV space, and really excited to be able to work with Kaluza and UKPN on this today. Vals?
Hey everyone, my name is Vals Grintals, and as previously mentioned, I work for a company called Kaluza. So just to give a quick overview of Kaluza, it's basically Kaluza is the ecosystem of intelligent platforms aiming to power future of energy. So this includes a variety of tools within this ecosystem, one of which is the kind of intelligent flexibility platform, which looks at optimizing smart devices across people's homes, including electric vehicles, which is, I guess, the focus area that we'll be talking about later today. Evie.
Hi, I'm Evie Trollow. I am an innovation project lead at UK Power Networks. And if you don't know who UK Power Networks are, we're a distribution network operator. So we distribute electricity from transmission level down to people's homes and commercial properties. We're one of 6 DNOs in the UK, and we serve 8.3 million customers who are connected to our network. And we're operating in the southeast of England. Our interest in electric vehicles has been around for a while, both trying to understand the impact on the network and then looking at the potential that they can offer for us in terms of flexibility. So excited to speak to you all today, and hope that this is of interest to everyone.
Thanks very much, everyone. So a little bit of housekeeping. For those of you who have been to Delta EE webinars before, this will be old hat. But for those of you who haven't, you should see on your web conferencing software, there's a function at the bottom where you can ask a question. So we will take questions at the end, but please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar as we go along. I'll keep a track on those. We can also do messages and answer questions as we go along. So there's a chat and hand raising function as well. But if you address it to me, and I'll pick those up as we go along, that would be wonderful. We also do have polls, and you'll see they should be pretty self-intuitive, but we'll get the results of the polls as we go along. We'll also send a summary at the end of the webinar. So without more further ado and enough chit-chatting from me, I'm going to hand over to Abhishek.
Right, so we're going to start with the poll, and I'm just going to launch it. So you should all have an option to select on your screen at the moment.
And as you can see, we're not allowed to vote, but this is really helpful for us, having a bit of context for the kind of questions you're asking and how to talk about the work we've been doing more recently. And it'll be interesting for everyone involved on the webinar to see who else is on the call.
So we're close to 70% of participants have voted, so we'll just give it another minute and proceed. Right, I'm about to close the poll. Can you all see the results on screen? So about 41% of people here are interested in providing flexibility services, which is interesting, which is good. I guess it's going to be quite interesting to hear from Kaluza and UKPN what they think of that, and which we'll get to shortly. About 20% already have an EV or are about to buy an EV, so real customers, which is interesting, and it matches with some of the customer research we've been doing as well. And there's about an equal split between energy suppliers, people involved with managing the grid, and about 10%, 11% of people involved in fleet management, which we think is going to be a very big sector and a very big interest going forward. Good. So that's given us a good overview of who's on the call and what your interests are, and hopefully we've covered all the key topics in pretty much that order. So I'm going to switch now and just do an introduction to smart charging. So simplistically, smart charging is the time shifting of EVs to manage electrical loads in the grid. That's the simplest way of looking at it. So the blue line here represents EV charging peak loads traditionally, but also the peak in the evening that the grid experiences. What the orange line here, which is shifted, represents is the movement of that to a later point where the grid is not naturally overloaded or doesn't have a lot of demand, which helps companies like UK Power Networks to regulate what's happening and also keep consistency of supply. So there are a few different approaches to smart charging. There's charger-centric smart charging, where the EV charger is let's say the decision maker, taking in different inputs from different parts of these charging ecosystem. So that's from the grid, and also from customers' individual usage patterns. There's home-centric, which is where there is a smart energy optimizer for your home, and you have lots of connected devices, which is a trend we're seeing coming up. It's still a niche market, but it's growing. And home-centric is quite often paired with solar PV, etc., to really locally manage energy consumption for customers. And something we are seeing the early stages of is car-centric, where the car is also involved in the decision-making process and starting and stopping charging accordingly. So what does it mean for the customer? Vals, would you like to tell us?
Yeah, of course. So you can see on the screen, obviously visual, kind of trying to pull together a full picture of how Kaluza sees smart optimization of any device, really. But I'll talk a bit more about customer side here. So this being the end customer or the homeowner with an EV. So what we've seen from the research we've been doing from our customers is that depending on a customer, they have different perceptions of what smart charging is, but roughly speaking, most people would consider smart charging to be a more cost-effective and a greener way of scheduling their EV charging, while still ensuring that the car is ready by the time that they expect it to be ready for them. And obviously this perception of what smart charging means to an end customer depends on the proposition that is given to them. And there's a variety of propositions that are based on either certain cost savings, cheaper piece of kit, or potentially even just ensuring that their carbon footprint is even lower through this charging. However, interestingly, obviously we've seen the customers are they have quite a specific idea of what smart charging brings in terms of greenness and cost savings. However, I think one of the gaps that we've seen in customer understanding and educating customers is what is the value or what is the role that smart charging plays in mitigating things like network constraints, or the role that smart charging can play on the network side of things. So yeah.
Thanks, Vals. And Evie, could you give out the perspective for the UKPN and the DNO's perspective?
Yeah, sure. So just to build on the sort of the network perspective that Bob touched on, from UK Power Networks perspective, we've currently got about 94,000 electric vehicles on our network. And by 2030, we're forecasting that that will increase to 3.6 million. So you start to understand the sort of scale of the challenge and the amount of growth that we're expecting as we start to facilitate the electrification of transport. And what's really important to us is that we facilitate that at the lowest cost to customers and make the best use possible of any existing network infrastructure that we have before looking to alternative solutions such as reinforcement. So smart charging for us is an option for one of those sort of smart solutions that we can use to shift demand to times where the capacity is available, if it is available on specific parts of the network. And by doing that, it reduces the peaks in demand, sort of flattens the demand profile and enables us to meet customers' needs without the need for additional reinforcement, or it can defer reinforcement so that we may be able to delay investments. And basically, by doing that and maximising flexibility where possible, we are able to facilitate the uptake of EVs at the lowest cost customers.
Super, thank you. One of the things that we've done at Delta is kind of really try to interrogate a bit about around smart charging and customers' preferences. And we did some research last year, which Abhishek will take us through, which I think throws a lot of light onto this, really.
Absolutely. So we've been running customer research specifically for EV and plug-in vehicle drivers for a few years. Last year, we did a specific section on smart charging, and we surveyed about 1,000 BEV and PHEV owners across the 5 key EU markets at that point, which were the UK, Netherlands, Norway, Germany, and France. And the key themes that we got as almost consistent across each market was the more mainstream it becomes, customers seem to understand it better, and they tend to use it more. And we've seen an increased uptake in people charging the EVs in a more smart manner during lockdown, as they maybe had the opportunity now to actually change things with electricity being generated by solar, etc., and cheap tariffs, etc. So they've been managing it themselves, but the more it becomes mainstream, the more people seem to understand it. However, because the number of EVs on the road aren't that many compared to the total car park, there's still low awareness of smart charging, and there's more education needed for that. But the early adopters of EVs are into the technology, they understand what they're doing, and the second wave of customers will probably be more interested in it from maybe a financial perspective, but it's there. One of the other key themes was energy suppliers are very well positioned to be providers because it's electricity, and customers go to an energy provider to buy electricity for their home, so they understand that, and it's the energy suppliers are in a very good position to be able to take on that customer relationship and expand on it, because also they trust you with they trust the energy suppliers with their domestic energy needs. Financial aspects was the number one reason for using smart charging, but environmental benefits was a very close second, which is not that surprising because you have a way to manage your costs, but also you can do something for the grid. And one of the key things which was almost a non-negotiable was customers expected their batteries to be charged by a certain point that they can preset, which is when they need their vehicle. Giving a manual override to customers as well so that they could choose to charge faster and maybe forego some of the financial benefits was seen as one of the ways of customer satisfaction and giving them the confidence that the car will be ready even if they need it out of process. And it's quite a common theme we've seen even this year when we've done our research.
So there's some real high customer expectations about what something means to be both smart and what it means for them in their own kind of personal day-to-day life, which I think is something we've seen when we started doing our EV research right from the beginning. Is there's a lot of kind of discussion about behavioural change needed around EVs, but actually customer expectations is, can you make it as least impact to me as possible, which sounds really obvious, but it's really helpful to have that kind of validated. Abhishek, do you think that will change much over the next few years?
I think with more customers buying EVs, and there's a whole bunch of EVs coming on the market right now, they will be trialing new things. And I still think customers will initially have that fear of what if my car's not charged. But over time, it's just like when someone buys an EV for the first time, they're going to have range anxiety. After a while, they get used to it and they don't worry about it as much. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So we've talked a little bit about customer preferences. I think the key thing is that it isn't as simple as it looks, really. And I think this is one for Kaluza.
Yeah, of course. Thanks. So as you can see here, one part of the kind of work we've done on this white paper was look at some of the smart charging challenges, and it was quite interesting to work together with UKP and obviously on this to see different perspectives on the challenges of someone who's trying to provide flexibility with EVs, and then someone who's looking at procuring that flexibility for the network benefits. And here you can see kind of the visual representation of different challenges that we saw. There's some overlap in terms of scale and customer attitudes, and then there's some separate pieces there from the provider side and the buyer side. So I'll talk a bit more about the specific challenges on the flexibility provider side, and I'll hand it over to Evie to talk about the flex buyer. So in terms of the kind of flexibility provider's perspective, you can see there's three key themes, so market design and processes, as well as hardware. So by flex market design and processes, what I'm talking about here is really the experience we've had with exploring different markets and trying to enter different markets, participating in different markets, which is that while these markets and the market processes are quite well designed for a large-scale flexibility participation, so megawatt scale, single assets, with potentially a very kind of easily predictable profile, but this isn't necessarily fit for purposes of EVs, which are more dynamic. They have a primary use which isn't as static, and similarly, baselining approaches that need to be applied to EVs are also, from our perspective, quite different from the more static assets. So all of this obviously creates a challenge for participation and scalability of participation from EVs. And I guess a more specific examples of this would be things like baselining, what I already mentioned previously, as well as just the timelines of the flexibility procurement itself. So obviously procuring flexibility months ahead for assets like EVs, which have seasonal usage and are quite hard to predict in terms of when the customer will be charging 6 months from now. A move to a closer to real-time procurement and things like that would ensure a more efficient use of EV flexibility in the future. So things like that, I think, are areas to potentially work on to help EV flexibility be utilized more efficiently. And then another point linked to the hardware, which I think is something that isn't being discussed that much, is talking about the hardware mismatch between what an OEM does to a EV or an EVSC in terms of its metering hardware and what the flexibility buyer would expect. And there's a certain gap that needs to be bridged to ensure that when there's a bigger capacity of EVs on the network, that those EVs are ready to provide flexibility and are fit for the purposes of the network. So really just communication between the OEMs, the flexibility providers, and the network operators about how to ensure that all of this is useful flexible capacity to the network is an important challenge to tackle in the short term. So yeah, that's kind of everything on the flex provider side.
And then I'll just elaborate a bit more on the network perspective side of things. So I think what's really important to reinforce is that the use of smart solutions and DSO flexibility markets, they're rapidly evolving. So it's something that we are continuing to work on, and a lot of this work has actually been done under trials and then implemented as quickly as possible into business as usual. But one of the key challenges for us as a network is understanding what the reliable and consistent shift in demand looks like. In order for networks to sort of deploy smart solutions as a viable alternative to investments, we really need to understand not what the average sort of response looks like, but understanding what the reliable response looks like, and to what degree we can utilize that flexibility that's available from different resources while meeting customers' needs. So that's one of the big elements that we're looking to address through projects at the moment, and understanding what factors actually impact that reliability, whether that's seasonality, just day-to-day usage, and also customers' preferences, because we know customers vary significantly and they all have different sort of wants and needs. The next point is conflicting services, and as well as that, I guess, is also synergies between services, but understanding that we need to try and understand what interaction network price signals, and specifically distribution network price signals, will have with other services or other price signals such as wholesale market or flexibility services at the national level. And this is also really important so that we can plan for different eventualities. And I think the last couple of months have sort of shown the need to do that and understand and stress test different scenarios. And we also just need to be able to plan a series of solutions to ensure that the network will be able to provide customers' needs under all those different scenarios. So those are two really key ones for us as networks as we start to build on DSO markets and price signals for flexibility.
Oh, thank you, Evie. I mean, I'm going to take the point that we've got in the kind of middle of that kind of concentric circle, those the overlapping circles around customer attitudes, and building up from the previous slide. About Kaluza, you guys placed a big emphasis on customers at being at the kind of the middle of your technology. What do you think are the real kind of challenges to the scaling up? And you've touched on a little few of them before, but what kind of really around customers' approaches to or their attitudes towards some smart charging innovations do you think are really kind of a barrier to scale?
So you can see in the middle there's the kind of scale and customer attitudes challenges. And I guess before talking about that, it's good to note that I think there's a lot of work that has been done by DSO, so UKPN specifically, to enable as much participation as possible in the flexibility markets. But still, even with this kind of help from the network side of things and more EVs emerging in the UK, more customers opting into smart charging, there's still a challenge of scale that we see, especially in achieving the kind of sufficient scales when you take into account all of the previously mentioned challenges and headroom requirements to participate in the national grid market. So while technologically the assets are able to provide a service, there's certain limitations in terms of the scale to do that. And similarly, on the DNO side of things, there's pockets in the network where providers like us have sufficient geographical density of EV installs to kind of provide flexibility in the CMZ, but it's a few examples where later this year we'll be providing flexibility with EVs, but realistically it's not a kind of market-wide opportunity because of the scale of EVs and the geographical density of installs we've seen not being sufficient enough to kind of enable participation in all of those markets, really. And going back to customer attitudes, from our perspective, obviously it's more about, as this is still, smart charging is still relatively early stages, learning about customers, what drives customers in terms of value, what drives customers in terms of their kind of user experience. All of that is very much being explored by us, but there's still questions around that, and I think things need to be investigated.
Yeah, okay. I mean, kind of, Evie, I'm going to ask you kind of a similar question, because it just goes back to your point around just having that bank of evidence around reliability but consistency, and I suppose the same is to be said for customer attitudes. Is there anything that from the innovation projects that you've done that you think really kind of stands out that is kind of limiting scale and customer uptake?
Yeah, I think the Volts has pointed out some really key points, particularly on customer attitudes, and I think we are still doing a lot of work to understand how reliable customers' responses are, and whether they opt out of propositions or whether they want to override smart charging sessions, and just understanding how that works, because when you're taking a more market-led approach to smart charging, that obviously allows the customer to be in control and have choice over their charging, which is really important. But we do need to understand the degree to which that impacts the level of flexibility that can be provided by smart charging. And in terms of the scale, I think, again, Volts raised some really key points around the market's still emerging. So actually having coincidence between a network need and where you've got EVs who are signed up to these propositions is something that is a little bit of a challenge at the moment, and we hope that as EV uptake increases, so does the uptake of smart charging. But we are doing as much as we can to sort of actively remove barriers to participating in flexibility markets. So for example, we reduced the minimum threshold to participate in LV flexibility markets to 10 kilowatts, and we'll continue to try and sort of remove barriers and make it as easy as possible for both domestic customers and more commercial customers to participate in flexibility markets and other sort of incentives for flexibility going forward.
Super, thank you. Abhishek, I really want to ask you about automotive. So the more automotive perspective on this, if you give me a kind of two kind of second view, really, if that's even possible.
I'll try.
Yeah.
I mean, the car itself is probably the most expensive part of the transaction from a customer's perspective. So it's clearly a very important aspect of this. So the car is very well placed to be turned up and down, but because cars are not designed for single markets with single regulations, it's quite a challenge for an automaker to incorporate let's say energy industry standards into their vehicle at the get-go. What they can do is make sure the car uses some charging standards to enable smart charging, but maybe not have the logic on board just yet. We are seeing a few OEMs, vehicle OEMs, start branching out into the energy space. Tesla, Nissan, Renault, Volkswagen, all come to mind, doing different things. Will they try doing a bespoke smart charging application in the car at some point? Quite possibly, but the automotive sector and the energy sector has always been separate. The electricity sector rather has always been separate. There's obviously a big overlap now, so we will see more OEMs getting involved, but maybe at different scales of involvement.
Yeah. Okay. It's really interesting. A couple of people have posted questions around the role of car-centric, which I don't think we're going to get too much time to touch on, but certainly we can follow up with the people who have asked questions around that after the webinar. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, well, we better move on.
We should. So we're going to spend a few minutes talking about the potential of smart charging. So there's been numerous studies, etc., over time, but we're going to use some data that we've seen and what the participating companies in this webinar have seen. So there's two different approaches. There's two main approaches rather to demand management. There's the passive approach that we've called passive, which is network investment. So that's what has been done over the years to deal with an increasing demand and deal with loads moving and load shifting, which is still a very relevant solution for scale in some geographies and some areas. Then there's the active approach, which is using smart and flexible services like smart charging, for example, where you might be able to reduce your CAPEX and incentivize the customer in other ways. But it's important to point out that there is no one answer. It entirely depends on geography and use case. And sometimes a passive investment makes more sense than an active approach. But where possible, the active approach helps the system optimize itself better. So, Vals, would you like to tell us about what that could mean?
Yeah, of course. So you can obviously see, as you mentioned, there's different scenarios and different cases on the network depending on the geographical location to determine where passive and active approach makes sense. But you can see that based on different studies that have been published, from using active approach in the places where it's considered to be actually beneficial, there's a potential for a cost saving to be somewhere in the range of 3 to 8 billion per year. So obviously it's important to know that this is not just pure value given back, but this is a saving on the cost that would have come to the network if all you did was just invest into new wires and updating the network itself. And this could also lead in reduction in generation capacity increments to 20 to 25 terawatt hours. So obviously, I guess what this illustrates is that by utilizing this smart and flexible demand on the customer side, and this could be on the CNI or residential scale, there's a clear cost saving that can be delivered to the network, and that's something that I think everyone should work towards in maximizing. Yeah.
So just to build on that from a network perspective, I think one of the key milestones that's really exciting to share with everyone, if you hadn't already heard, is that in June we actually awarded our first contracts to EV smart charging service providers, which is the first for the UK, which is just sort of demonstrates how quickly the DSO markets are evolving and the potential, and that it's starting to become something that we're doing as part of our business as usual activities. This figure here, I thought it was just useful to reiterate sort of how smart charging fits into our overall investment strategy and strategy for enabling the uptake of electric vehicles. So we start off with forecasting and trying to understand where and when EV uptake is going to occur. Then where we see that there is likely to be further uptake or we're starting to approach the limits of the network, it's important to increase visibility in those areas, and that can be either through network monitoring or third-party data. And then once we do see that there is a need for an intervention of some sort, there are basically sort of two approaches, as was described, the passive or active approach. The way that we've committed to a flexibility first approach, so we will always look to deploy flexibility in the first instance, and that fits under like our deploy smart strategy. So there are a number of different technical and commercial solutions that we can use, and smart charging fits into that category. And basically that deploy smart is intended to maximize the use of existing network capacity where it's available. And then once we've done that, or we've made an assessment about the specific network needs, there will be areas where we will need to invest strategically. And for example, that might be areas where there's synergies with other load growth, such as the electrification of heat, or it might be that there's not sufficient flexibility to address a constraint. So it's important that we do recognise that there is a need to invest strategically in some instances, and that we plan for those as well. And then, of course, going right back to forecasting. So as we get more information through trials and understand how customers are using smart charging, we need to go back and sort of refine our forecast, and so on and so on.
That's great, Evie. There's actually been a question around this in the Q&A, which hopefully we can kind of elaborate a little bit more. But hopefully that partly answers the questions around how networks need to approach the investment and how this fits in, specifically in this smart charging example, compared to many other DNOs that might be in Europe or across the world. We've got to move on. Now, the next thing we're going to talk is a really good example about this is Project Shift, which is a trial project that UKPN are leading. I think that's right, in the UK. But anyway, I'll hand over to Evie to introduce what this project.
Yeah, so I'll just give a really high-level introduction to Project Shift. Some of you may have heard of it before, but if not, it's our innovation project that's trialling a market-led approach to smart charging. So there's been a few other studies more looking at a managed charging approach, but this is an approach where we are looking at different mechanisms where we can incentivize smart charging with market participants. And there's three different mechanisms that we're trialling, as shown on the left. So there's the LV flexibility procurement with EV Energy, time of use, distribution use of system charges with Kaluza, and capacity-based pricing with Octopus Energy. And if you want more information on how they work, then have a look at our website. But this is basically fitting into our overall strategy of deploy smart and trialing commercial solutions, which smart charging fits into, to understand how customers actually respond to these, what level of response we get from the market, and starting to answer those questions around reliability of response and the impact of conflicting signals. And we're trialing each of these products with over 300 customers in each trial. So we're about halfway through the project, and the intention is just to collect a year's worth of data to start to try and answer some of those questions around the value of smart charging and what the network impact of that is.
Wonderful. So thanks, Abhishek. The Kaluza are playing a technology role in this, and Val's is going to give us a bit of an explanation about what everyone's favourite idea about shifting demand.
Yeah, thanks, Charmaine. Thanks, Evie. So yeah, I'll talk a bit more about one of the trials as part of Project Chip. I'll talk through some of the early findings from the project, as well as the kind of basic description of approach that we've taken here. So as Evie mentioned, our part of this project involved looking at adjusted time of use, distribution time of use tariff to be implemented on the price signal for optimization of the EVs. So since September 2019, we have been running this pilot scheme with using around 300 smart chargers across London and southeast of UK. And in this project, basically, what our platform does is uses a full stack of electricity pricing data in combination, so wholesale electricity pricing data in combination with network price feed from UKPN, which includes this adjusted distribution network use of system charge, as well as the existing transmission use of system charge. And this stack price is used for the optimization. And really what the trial seeks to demonstrate is that the efficient time of use networks help with optimizing the existing network capacity, and can be a great tool to help someone like UKPN to manage peak loads. And in particular, in this trial, we're kind of aiming to quantify the ability to reduce EV demand at peak times, the impact of smart charging on EV charging diversity, as well as the scalability and cost savings that are potential for both grid operators and end customers. And in the pictures here, you can see kind of an illustrative example of how this works. So on the left, you can see illustration of consumption of unmanaged EV. On the right, you can see illustration showing this same consumption, but optimized through Kaluza platform against those prices. So the blue line in both charts represent this kind of full price stack against which the EVs are optimized. And in an unmanaged case, obviously, the car plugs in at 5 o'clock, immediately starts charging and charges until it's full at around 10 o'clock, which shows that obviously big part of this demand occurs at times when the prices are high, which implies obviously high demand and stress on the network. While on the illustration on the right, you can see that obviously this charging has been moved to price times or price signal times, where it shows that stress on the system is lower, thus meaning that it's better for the network operator and the local network level. So that's kind of the rough description of how the approach that we've taken as part of Project Shift. But obviously it's interesting to have a look at the real results from the project. So in the next slide, you can see how this looks based on the data gathered from the first few months of capturing data from these 300 plus EVs. So this is showing a normalized charging profile for the EVs. So on the left side, you can see kind of unmanaged case. So this is what we do on the platform side, is we look at what would have happened if the car wasn't managed by anyone and it was just charging whenever the customer plugged in. So kind of unmanaged case, and on the right you can see what has actually happened as part of this trial. And I guess the main thing that really this shows is that in the unmanaged case, you can clearly see the peak demand, or the kind of most of the daily consumption happening in this red zone, which would be the kind of time when the local network would be under highest levels of stress, or likely to be under high level of stress in terms of the load there. And on the right, you can see that most of this demand has shifted to hours of lower demand, meaning that it kind of relieves some of the stress from the network to a lower demand time. And this is, it's first of all, it's great to see these results, that the first few months have shown that there's a significant capability to shift this load away from the red times and potentially deliver these benefits to the network. And there's also quite a bit of diversity in charging, even if you shift, even if you optimize those devices against certain price signals. And some of the things that we'll still be discovering as part of this trial, which I think ends in November of this year, is also looking at these profiles and overlaying these profiles with the household load to see how the overall load looks on the network side, and that's something that UKPN will be modeling as well. And separately to that, one of the things that we've been looking at is also, as you can see on the chart on the right, that there's still some charging happening in the peak hours of network demand, and this is largely due to things like customers overriding charging. So obviously customers have the ability to override it if they need that. And one of the things that we've been exploring quite a lot is how can we educate people about overrides and incentivize people to maybe override less, or consider other approaches to ensuring that their car is charged by a certain time. So yeah, I think it's been, the results are encouraging to see, and it's been quite an exciting project from our side to explore this type of proposition and how these types of signals can really help and provide demand shifting to the network. Yeah. So that's kind of a rough description from my side, and obviously there's more information on the white paper itself about the trial and some of the results, and some more data as well.
Yeah, Baltz, we've got a lot of questions around this bit, so I think probably what we'll do is try and answer some of them in the quick Q&A at the end, but then we'll follow up with them afterwards, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So I think we are going to move on to the last poll. So we've got just this and some next steps, but this is really helpful for us to kind of, based on what you've heard so far, what you think the biggest challenge for smart charging is. And so we've touched on some of these pieces, and we touched on these in the white paper. So maybe do this now, have a read of the white paper and see if you change your mind. We'll give you a very quick kind of 35 seconds to vote, just so I'm conscious of time. But policy and market design, always, especially around the flexibility markers, is a real challenge. Baltz touched on hardware and some of the hardware issues that is going to likely to kind of emerge in the next few years. The reliability of response. So a lot of the questions have been, how do you basically deal with conflicting services or conflicting assets, trying to do conflicting things? And that's obviously a real challenge. How to scale. We've talked quite a lot about scaling up, and I think that's very relevant for everything in decarbonising energies, mobility, electric vehicles, and then clearly customer attitudes are key. But we'll give you, so we've got most people have voted. I'll give you another 5-10 seconds. Some of you are a bit indecisive today, maybe. I know what I would go with, but I'm not allowed to vote. Okay, if we close it off there, Abhishek, thank you. So kind of from a high level, there you go, thank you very much. So clearly policy and market design. I think probably a bit reflective of the people we have on the line who are very close to trying to do something now in the market. I think there are challenges in the market design, and we're in that interesting stage of either being just a bit ahead or a bit behind of the curve. I'm not really sure which one, but it's interesting that customer attitudes and is a close, well, not a close second, is second really. But thank you very much for that. So I think if we, the last kind of summing up side really, from myself and Abhishek, is really what next. So I think personally from my perspective, you know, we're still quite a way off around domestic flexibility, and there's a lot of potential obviously, but in the UK, for those non-UK listeners, our net zero ambitions by 2050 or even sooner, depending on which political party you subscribe to, is really quite it's quite a big challenge. And so how can we really unlock this flexibility to do that? It must be the question we really have to answer as soon as possible. When Abhishek and I were looking at this earlier today, I think we talked about policy and regulation, as so many people on the call have suggested, but also, and hopefully shown by this call, is really cooperation across different sectors and actors in the smart charging value stream. So we really need a lot more conversations across everyone to kind of maximize and optimize this. I mean, Abhishek, is there anything else you want to add at this stage?
I just think that EVs and unlocking the flexibility is going to be quite critical and quite useful for the grid, and with adoption expected to take off of EVs, we should see a similar trend for smart charging because it's entirely linked to it. But no, I think you've covered everything there realistically that I was going to say. So
wonderful. So I appreciate everyone's being still online, so thank you for that. We're going to do two questions, and we'll actually two kind of key things. We've got a white paper. You can't actually click here because obviously it's a web form, but it's available on Delta's website, and we will send a link to the white paper in our email follow-up.
Yeah, we'll send a copy of these slides as well.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. So that's been a question. But the two questions that I picked out, one, someone asked, let me just find it very quickly. This is for all panelists, but maybe if Valts goes first. I mean, someone asked, do we see the smart charging of EVs as a standalone service, or will it either have to or likely to form a service for an overall asset base of, say, kind of microgeneration storage in a more of a VPP platform kind of proposition?
It's a good question. I guess from Kaluza's side of things, what we are doing and what we'll be doing later this year is we'll be, I think historically, it's been easier to provide a service from just a fleet of EVs or a fleet of home batteries separately. But I think the market needs to move in a direction where you can provide flexibility from a combination of EVs, batteries, a microgeneration potentially. So really VPP approach, and that's something that I guess we'll be doing later this year, is just providing flexibility from EVs combined with home batteries in one of the DNO regions. So I think that's where we see it moving, and I think that's where we see the biggest benefits coming from. An easier way to scale up fundamentally, because if you just utilize EVs, obviously there's a challenge of scale that we already discussed previously.
And EV, does it, from the UK PN's perspective, sorry, not personal perspective, does it matter what the asset base really is, as long as you guys can access the flexibility?
Yeah, you're right. So we're UKPN are technology agnostic, so it doesn't really matter where the flexibility comes from, and we're happy to take flexibility from any assets. I think our main interest in these projects is actually trying to understand the impact of EVs specifically, and we're doing similar projects for other technology types and looking at how that will sort of work in combination. But we know that because of the transition to net zero and electrification of transport is starting to happen, there will be a lot of EVs on the network, so understanding that flexibility for those assets specifically is very useful for us as well. But in general, for flexibility tenders and that kind of thing, it's all technology agnostic, so we don't mind where the flexibility comes from.
Abhishek, do you have any thoughts from the kind of work that we've been doing over the last couple of years on that? You can say no.
Well, I have many thoughts. I'm just trying to summarize them into a few. I think EVs will be quite useful in making some of this happen, but there are obviously still challenges from the auto sector that might mean it's still not fully integrated at the start. But I mean, we could go into this dialogue for a long time, so I'm conscious of that.
I do want to ask one last question, which I think personally is very interesting, and it's kind of not just around the EV sector, but generally around the energy transition. So some of the questions I would broadly group under the issues with proliferation of potential options. So obviously very nascent, well, reasonably nascent market, lots of innovation, lots of interesting things going on, and then lots of different service providers all together. I mean, how do the kind of the participants feel about it? How will it play out? So obviously there'll be some sort of M&A, but who might be the winning type of provider in the kind of consolidation of the market? Abhishek, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Who will be the winning provider?
That's a big question.
That's a very big question. I'm not sure I want to give an answer to that. But I think that there will be consolidation. We're already seeing consolidation of some of the more innovative companies, startups who are now part of some of the more traditional energy players, and we'll see more consolidation. Just as with any new technology, we'll have options for a while, and they will all pivot towards a few big competing standards. From a smart charging perspective, I still think the energy companies, the utilities, that the customer-facing ones, are in a good position to be able to provide that. But strategic partnerships behind the scenes is going to be ideal, and I mean we're seeing examples of that now.
Okay, thanks. And Evie, I don't know if you have a perspective on this.
From our perspective, we're keen to get as much participation and flexibility as possible, and in order to do that, I think we need to provide choices for customers. So some customers will want to engage with us directly. There'll be other customers who want to go through a service provider, or others who just want it to be as simple as possible. And perhaps there'll be propositions that enable that just through quite straightforward tariffs, and they won't even realize that they're actually sort of providing flexibility or why that flexibility is important. So I think it's going to be key to make sure that we look at what customers across the board will want, and then make sure that the propositions to enable all types of customers to participate are available.
Thank you. And Val's final word before we sign off for today?
Yeah. Obviously, it's coming from Kaluza's side, a bit of biased opinion here potentially, but I do believe that there obviously will be some M&A activity, and there will be some consolidation in the market. But I think the market benefits from having a variety of different flux providers. I think everyone has their own kind of unique capabilities. There's aggregators that are very much focused on C&I space. Obviously, our focus is more on residential scale, so better understanding of domestic customers and how home charging works. So I think currently market is benefiting from just a variety of different providers. So yeah, I think there's more. I think there's more consolidation needed potentially on the I guess how you interface with the market and some of the ways and platforms in which you utilize to provide that flexibility more than anything. But yeah, agree with everything that's previously said as well.
Okay, well, thank you for speakers, Evie, Valts and Abhishek. Thank you for you guys for dialing in. I hope it was useful. As Abhishek and I said before, the recordings of the webinar will be made online on Delta's website. The white paper is always also available to download from just after this webinar now. We can send the slides on request, and we'll follow up on any questions that we didn't answer in the next day or so. But if you want more information around Delta's work on EVs, that's on our website as well, and on Project Shift and UKPN and Kaluza's work in this area. There's a bit more in the white paper, but they'll have links to their work as well. And just say thank you once again, and hope to see you on a Delta EE webinar soon.
Thank you, Charmaine, and thanks, Vals, and thanks, Evie.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Cheers.